Greetings and welcome to IPDay's Webinar Wednesday. My name is Dr. Kevin Smith. I'm here with my colleague Lori Lee from the Florida Center for Reading Research, and we're excited to be able to share with you today evidence-based practices for teaching literacy across the content areas. So again, my name is Dr. Kevin Smith, and I work at the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University, and I've been involved with providing professional development for K-12 and adult educators for probably about 20 years. And I've had the good fortune to work with Dr. Lori Lee for about 15 of those years. So Lori, do you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Lori Lee, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. We really enjoy working with educators of adults. That's something that we delved into several years ago, and we are grateful to be with you. And we thank you for all the work that you do every day. We know that you really make a difference, not only in the lives of the students you serve, but also in their families and communities as well.
Absolutely. So as we get started, I'm just going to take care of a few things to remember from IPDay. The chat is open for this webinar because we're going to have hopefully a lot of interaction. We're going to have some questions for you and some discussion that we'll have through the chat box. If you do have a question, you can also type that into the Q&A option, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you have as they come up through that route as well. Your microphones will be muted, so you'll be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is being recorded. It will be archived and available on the IPDay website within 48 hours. So as Lori mentioned, thanks so much for joining us. We can't thank you enough for being here with us today and learning a little bit about what we have to share, and we hope to learn from you as well.
Okay, we'd like to start off this afternoon by just sharing with you the goal that we have for this session, as well as some objectives. What we'd like for you to leave with today is just a greater understanding of how to use multiple literacy strategies in your content area, in the classes that you teach in your work with adults. And then also there's two objectives there as well. What you're going to do this afternoon is, as much as we can virtually, allow you to participate in a content area lesson using multiple literacy strategies. So you'll take on the role of a student this afternoon, and then we'll debrief following the lesson and probably along the way as well. And so that's what you'll be in for in the next hour or so that we're together. So first of all, we just like to share a little bit with you in regard to what a multi-strategy comprehension approach is. And you see some information there on your screen. But I'd like for you to think about real quickly what kinds of things you do when you encounter text that is complex, that you don't have a background in, that may have difficult vocabulary to comprehend, that's challenging for you. So what are some of those things that you do? And I think we'll let you actually practice using the chat feature and just enter in, if you would, some of the strategies that you use when you encounter text that's difficult for you. So if you would, go ahead and enter in the chat some of the things that you do. What do you do when you come across text that's really difficult for you and you know it's important that you have a comprehension of that text? And while you're go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, I'm really glad that you asked that question. I'm seeing some people introduce themselves in the chat, and we'd love to hear. Thanks, Linda, putting an answer in there about what you try to focus on. I know a few of Lori's children are physicians, and they have shared some texts that are pretty challenging for us. So we certainly have to rethink our approach to text when we receive those texts that are above our normal fluency and comprehension level.
Right. And so some of you are putting in the chat that you use a variety of strategies, especially pertaining to vocabulary. So you look at the vocabulary words that you don't know. You may take a moment and look them up, or you may reach for an online resource. Some of you are saying that you have a dictionary available. Some of you, someone just said that they read the text aloud, that sometimes helps them. One of the things that I do is that I slow my reading rate. I can't read as quickly as I would a novel for enjoyment if I'm trying to work my way through some very difficult text. And so I read more slowly. And that's not indicative of someone that has fluency problems. That's indicative of a good reader, because that's a strategy we use to help ourselves comprehend. Thomas said that he makes sure he understands the organizational scheme. That's really important. If you know how that text is supposed to be organized, that will help you understand more deeply. Paraphrase each paragraph, so you chunk it. Thank you, Audrey. That's something that we often do. We can't read all the way through because we can't comprehend all of that at the same time. So you try to put in your own words what you encounter in a paragraph by paragraph way. Read, stop, and process. I love that. Thank you, Marissa. I haven't seen it yet, but I bet this is something you do. Reread. So you get to the end of a sentence or a paragraph and you may go back and reread to make sure that you understand what that just said. So that's something that we do. So we do a variety of different things to help ourselves. We know when our comprehension has broken down, reread text and look up vocabulary. Sometimes we might even have to work on that decoding. And so hearing someone read it aloud might help us. If that way we can gain a knowledge of how to pronounce the words that we don't know. Linda said she makes our own T-chart with main ideas and details. So you write about that text. And so some of you may take notes in the margin, some of you may make charts. So you do a variety of different things to help yourself comprehend text that might be challenging. And I'm guessing that you don't just use one of those, that in fact, when I encounter difficult text, I slow my reading rate, I reread where I need to, I make note annotations or create some kind of writing about that text. I work on the vocabulary. I may have to look a word up or approach that vocabulary in a different way. So I use all of those things at the same time. And Dorrit said that the rereading and using context clues is important in gaining that comprehension as well. So thank you for that. Thanks for using the chat and participating with us. We appreciate that. So you get the idea. We're using more than one strategy. And so in what we're sharing with you this afternoon, that's what we're going to help you to help your adult learners to do. Use more than one strategy to help themselves comprehend text.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I really appreciated that discussion. And I really like Terry's thought as well about going to Google. I would go to Google or phone a friend or find some other resource in addition to some of those other pieces. So I thought that was a really good approach as well. All right, so I'm going to quickly talk about your sample lesson materials. These are all posted on the IPDAY website so that you have access to them and they'll be there. I'm going to put some links in the chat as well so that you can access the handouts also if you need to right on the spot. So there's links to the text that we're going to use today. The artificial retina receives FDA approval by Dina Headley. That's the text we're going to use for this lesson. You also have a handout for writing that we're going to use. You also have 2 graphic organizers, one a directed note-taking handout and one a question generation handout. So we're going to use all of those handouts today. And I did put links in the chat so that you have access to those as we go through the lesson. And I appreciate Jacinta Elliott's note as well, using the dictionary and researching what the topic is. I think those are really excellent ideas. So those are the handouts that you have. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the first part of our lesson. So what I want you to do, and this is where we usually start these lessons, is we have some kind of question that we think, we call this a hook question or a topic question, something we think our students are going to be interested in. So it's related to the content. And even before we start reading now, I'll give you some pointers in a minute, but we try to throw a question out that's going to make our students think about the topic, and so that we know that they've thought about it before we ever start reading. So the question I want you to respond to in the chat is, what impacts would the invention of a device that would provide restoration of sight have on the lives of the blind? So let's think about that. Someone's creating devices that will help restore sight. How do you think that might change the lives of the blind? So go ahead and in the chat, it'll probably take you a moment to type that in, but just type a phrase, a sentence, a couple of words, letting us know what you think that would cause in terms of changes for the lives of the blind. So I'll give you a minute or so to add some things to the chat. I know it can take a minute. Like I said, it may be a whole phrase or a sentence that you might need to share this response, but just think what you think that would do to change people's lives. What aspects of their lives might change? I like Christine's response. They may be able to drive, to give them some independence, right, that they haven't had before. So Christine, that's an excellent answer. And I appreciate your thinking there. Absolutely. Anyone else think of any other changes? Good, be able to read in a different way, even if they know Braille. Again, make them read, open up a whole new world. Absolutely. There's a lot of different aspects to life. Reading by sight instead of feel. Good, Rob. The joys of art. Yes, it's probably very different to see artwork than to experience in other ways. They could be disoriented. And I'm glad you said that, Thomas, because sometimes people don't think of the potential negative consequences. There's additional stimuli that could be disoriented at first just based on all the additional stimuli that comes in. Nadra says, I believe although there'd be lots of positive things, it could be extremely overwhelming. So, moving right forward with Thomas's theme, you're right. At first, I'm sure it would be. Enjoy nature and explore more, Carrie. Absolutely. You could be more self-sufficient, understand the beauty of nature. Thanks, Diana. You might need therapies to adjust to that, Christine. I think you're exactly right. So it would be an impact on people's lives. I think we know that we cause changes. Independence, absolutely, Durrett. And Brenda said it would open up our eyes to beautification, seeing color, a lot of things that sighted people take for granted. That's a good point, Brenda. For those who experience sudden blindness, it would provide an immediate assurance to carry on without such a shock. That's a good point. So if you're becoming blind or do become immediate blind, maybe there's hope for you. That's a good point, Linda. They could see their family for the first time. There'd be so many things people would have to adjust. Yes. And we have heard people, Suzanne, before that say that maybe their significant other looks differently than they thought. And that's something that participants, if we give them long enough, will bring up. So you see the point of this, right? So I can see you understand the concept of what we're going to talk about. So you saw the title of the article maybe a moment ago, Artificial Retina Receives FDA Approval. So there's actually a new device. It's actually not even that new anymore. It's 10 years old now, that does restore sight for some blind people or people with a certain condition, at least partially restores sight. So this is a real live headline from a story that we're going to talk about. So this gives me some insight to know that you all understand the concept, the folks who responded, understand the concept that we're going to talk about, and made you maybe a little bit more interested in what we're going to read. Now, what I'll say is you don't want to spend forever as a teacher doing this part because we haven't started reading text yet. Part of what we like to see is building engagement, building appreciation for the content and the concept, but you don't want to spend forever doing this because, again, we haven't gotten to the text yet. So this is about as much time as I'd want to spend. And the chat worked beautifully. You guys are doing a great job. And Carol, absolutely, it could help them with independence. And absolutely, they could enjoy nature and family events more and provide motivation to learn. Yeah, you're right, Audrey, just going through this can help provide motivation to learn new things. That's the goal. That's what we're really trying to do. So I'm glad that you thought of that as we debrief this part. Okay. So next up, what we have our students do. So if you look at the writing response to reading handout, if you click on that link or you go to the handout you may have received earlier, you'll see we've got a question on there. So what we typically do now is ask a predictive question. And in this case, if you look at that first handout, the writing in response to reading handout, it says predict which factors may impact the development and design of a technology-based medical innovation. So think about that. We've got scientists who are actually working to create a device to help restore the lives of the blind. And I'll put that out for the chat too. What are some things you think might impact that? What are some of the things that you think have to be considered for the scientists who are working on these kinds of devices? So again, you've got biomedical experts, you've got technologists, you've got computer programmers, you've got grant writers, you have all these people working on this device that the FDA has just approved based on this article. What are some of the things that might play into trying to create a device like this? Absolutely, Thomas. Ease of manufacturing. How hard is it to manufacture? Audrey, finances. Absolutely, it's going to be part of it. Kay, really good point. Maybe the body rejects it. You have to think about how does the technology interact with your body? Christine, cost is definitely a fact. James, cost. Audra, can it be universal or does it have to be adjusted? That's a really good question. And Suzanne, affordability for the person. Absolutely. Is this something that's provided for free through government assistance? Is there a sliding scale? Is it incredibly expensive? Audrey, absolutely. Technology. Who's going to program and build this thing? So those are all really important factors to consider. So what I would have you do now is take potential profits, Carol. That always comes into play, right? So what I'd have my students do now that we've discussed it is write a couple of sentences or at least a bulleted list of things from our discussion they think might be these factors that impact. So from our discussion, what do they think are important things to keep in mind? Yeah, funding, ease of operations, will it meet the needs of the people? All those things are good. So what I'd have you do is just take some of the things you think personally are most critical to the development of these devices and just write either a couple of sentences or a bulleted list on that handout to show me what you think. So you're predicting, right? So we haven't read the article yet, but we've talked about really the main thrust of the article now. So you would be able to make a prediction. Then what you would do is we go through, we're going to read the article and you'll see were my predictions correct. Okay. So there's research that shows that reading achievements increase at all grade and ability levels when we teach students to activate and build background knowledge, which we just did, and preview, predict, and confirm predictions, which we're going to do. So, oh, and no problem at all, Audrey. Yeah, the links are in the chat if you need to see those. You might need to scroll up now. And I'll tell you what, I'll put them in again just in case you've gone past that. So I'm going to put the links to the handouts in the chat again. Okay, so again, there's a lot of research that says if we build motivation, if we build engagement with students, there's a good chance that they're going to comprehend more than they would otherwise. So leading these kinds of discussions before you get to the text can really help both with your understanding of what the students already know about the topic and help them predict things they think might come up if you come up with the right question, and then again, confirm after they start reading. So that's the purpose of doing that. Okay, we're going to move forward now, and Lori's going to share a little bit of vocabulary instruction with you.
Okay, many of you listed vocabulary as something that you would definitely pay attention to if you were working your way through some challenging text for you. And so that's definitely a strategy that research shares with us that's really important that we do for our students, and that is to provide that explicit vocabulary instruction to help them comprehend text that we're going to be working with. And so the text, and we gave you Kevin shared with you the name of the article. And in case you don't have access to it, again, the title is Artificial Retina Receives FDA Approval. This comes from the National Science Foundation, and it's a press release. And it was released 10 years ago yesterday, actually. And so this article, I'll just provide just a brief overview so you get a sense of what this is about, again, if you don't have access to it. What this article does is provide just some information about this device that is a prosthetic technology that has a component that sits on some glasses and then also links to a part in the eye, an implant in the eye, to help people that have been blinded by a specific issue, and that is retinitis pigmentosa. And so it helps them to see. And so the article traces the development of this particular technology, this device. It talks about the funding for the device. It talks about the motivation of those who developed it and why they were interested in doing this in the first place. It talks about the successes and the challenges that the developers faced along the way. It describes the device in detail. And then it also it provides a timeline that talks about the development process and where they started and where they were to this point. And so all of those things are addressed in this particular article. So if you have access, that's great. If you don't, that provides a little bit of background for you. So we want to talk about these particular vocabulary words. If you're looking at the article and you're saying to yourself, well, I don't know about the selection of those words, I would have chosen different words, that's absolutely fine. You know your students and you know the text that they can handle. So these were just words that we chose as an example for you and to just model how we might go about figuring out the definition of these particular words. And you see the methods that we use in each one of those. And so you see the word prosthesis, microelectrode array, and also ophthalmology. And all of those we can use word parts and also the context of the text. And several of you mentioned that when we were talking about those strategies that you use when you encounter text that's difficult for you. And so the word prosthesis, we'll just share that that's a really important word to know the meaning of, because basically this whole article is about a technology that is indeed a prosthesis. So if you don't know what that is, then it's going to be very difficult to understand the article itself. And so this word appears actually in the secondary heading, so right below the title of the article itself. And sometimes those headings and those features that appear in text, although they're meant to call our attention to various aspects, sometimes we as readers may completely overlook them. And so we need to make sure that our learners are well aware that those bold-faced headings, those graphs and charts and photographs are very important, and they can gain valuable information by paying attention to those. And so the heading that we're looking at, actually we've labeled as paragraph 1, and it says Argus 2 is first approved prosthesis to restore limited vision to those blinded by retinitis pigmentosa. So prosthesis, if you have your text and you can underline it or highlight it in some way, this actually, if we look at the literal meaning of the word parts that are involved here, that first part of the word, P-R-O-S, pros, actually means to put in place. And then the last part is an addition. So you're basically putting in place an addition. And this was actually adopted in the 1700s by the medical community to mean an artificial part to supply or enhance a defective part of the body. So that's what that literally means. And so if we look back and think about that meaning in context, it's the first approved artificial part to restore limited vision to those blinded by retinitis pigmentosa. We can see that the context does indeed confirm what our word parts are telling us. So we get that confirmation through the context. Then in paragraph 3 of this particular text, and again, if you don't have that in front of you, that's okay. But the words or that short phrase, microelectrode array, are there. And so again, if we can look at our word parts and kind of separate some parts out that we might know what they mean. So micro, meaning small. And so you think about all the words that you know that have micro in them, and that, like microscope, leads us to that thinking that micro means small. So we know this is small. We look at electrode, and we may think about electricity, which is essentially is a pathway. So we have a small pathway, and array is really an arrangement. So you've got a small pathway that's in a particular arrangement, and that's what this is. And so if we look at the sentence, it says the device called the Argus 2 retinal prosthesis system transmits images from a small eyeglass mounted camera wirelessly to a microelectrode array, or to a small pathway that's arranged in such a way that it connects to a patient's damaged retina. Okay, so again, our context is confirming our word parts. And again, when we use context, we may be doing some inferencing, and we may not get the exact dictionary definition of that particular word, but that's okay. If it makes sense in that context, we can move on with our reading, and we don't have to leave the text to access some other resource. So our dictionary, Google, our online resources are valuable and they're important. But if we don't have to break out of the text, if we can continue on with our reading, that's preferable, because then we don't interrupt our comprehension. So we can just move on. And then the last word we'll look at is ophthalmology. And ophthalmology is in paragraph 6 of the text, if you have it there. And you may be familiar. Again, we're going to look at those word parts. That first part of that word, the optal part, means eye, pertaining to the eye. And oftentimes there are word parts like that, especially in science-related text, that if we know those word parts, like bio means life, and like the first part of this word means eye, that will really help us not to just understand what this word means, but also what other words that contain that particular part mean as well. So it helps us to generalize. And the last part of that word, the ology part, means the study of. So for instance, if we know bio means life, ology means the study of, we know that biology is the study of life. And much like this word that we encounter in this text, ophthalmology, the study of the eye. And so we see, again, confirming with our context, seeing my grandmother go blind motivated me to pursue ophthalmology, or the study of eyes, and biomedical engineering to develop a treatment for patients for whom there was no foreseeable cure. And so we see the beginning of that sentence, seeing my grandmother go blind motivated me. And so ophthalmology seems to make sense in connection with that. And so we have meanings there that we can figure out without leaving our text if we have some knowledge of word parts, and also if we can use our context. So there's definitely research that validates this strategy. We know that using context analysis for inferring those word meanings is valuable. Again, we don't have to leave the text if we can do that. And then morphemic analysis, or using those word parts to help us derive meaning, is very powerful as well. And again, if your students know a variety of Greek and Latin roots, that can really help them in transferring and allowing them to figure out not only the word that they're particularly encountering in a text, but also other words in other texts that they may encounter at other times. So those are valuable strategies that can be used to help us gain an understanding of vocabulary that may be difficult. Okay. Another aspect of vocabulary instruction has to do with teaching academic vocabulary central to the meaning of the text. And so we just did that, providing those words that are important to understanding this particular text. But we also need to be sure that our students have an understanding of that academic vocabulary, that language of school, that is oftentimes used, especially in providing directions. So if you ask your students to summarize something and they paraphrase it, so rather than just providing a condensed kind of version of the text, they put it in their own words, which is a little bit different. Is it because they didn't know how to do one of those things, or was it because they were confused in regard to the direction? Did they summarize when they should have paraphrased, or the other way around because they didn't know the meaning of those particular words when it came to what the task actually was? And so we need to make sure that our students are well versed in those kinds of words, and especially as they move on to take the tests that they need to take to acquire credentials or their GED or whatever it may be. They need to have a good understanding of those kinds of words, so that when they take those tests, they're not missing an item because they just flat don't know what they're being asked to do. So those are really important.
Good. I know we were going to ask you now, and you mentioned this earlier on. What are some of the tools and resources you use to look up or teach vocabulary? So if you're looking up words, or what do you use to teach vocabulary, look up words? So in the chat, if you could let us know, what are some of those resources that you frequently use? And some of you mentioned that when we asked earlier on, or Lori asked earlier on, what you do when you read, but we thought it'd be helpful just to ask what tools or resources you use to teach vocabulary in your particular situation. Good. So wordreference.com, dictionary.com. So we have a lot of online resources. Excellent. Use Google to find the words in their language. If you're teaching speakers of other languages, absolutely. Good. Google is another resource that's used. Good. Dictionary.com, depending on the context. Good. There's a Webster app as well. Excellent. So a lot of good resources that you use, and actual dictionaries. Always like those, Brenda. Excellent. Sometimes etymology can help. And like Lori said, the Greek and Latin roots, especially if they're a speaker of another language, that can actually help them understand. You know, many of our words come from Greek and Latin roots, as do many of the languages that some of your students may speak. Yes, the glossary is a good point. That's something we often ask about as well. For the text, go ahead, Lori.
And you can find those lists of Greek and Latin roots online really easily. And so there's a lot of just really quick and short activities that you can do with those to help students to gain an understanding of those. And again, you know, those just enable them to not only determine the meaning of one word, but they generalize to a lot of different words. So that's a valuable resource.
Good. Oh, Rob, we're glad that someone provided the word glossary for you. We know how that
Yes.
happens. The word bailed on you. I like the way you
Yeah.
said that. And thanks, Linda, for sharing. I'm familiar with everything that's been shared except for ninjawords.com. Lori, is that one you're familiar with?
It's not. So I'm excited to take a look at that.
Good. We always love learning new things. So thanks for sharing that one, Linda. We're not familiar with ninjawords.com. All right. So what we're going to work with you next is our first full comprehension strategy. So of course, students need to know the words, especially those words that are most critical to comprehension of the whole text. And Lori did a great job sharing ways you can teach your students words that need to be front loaded. Next, we're going to move into text coding, which is getting to some of the other strategies that you mentioned, what you have to do when you read and you don't catch something as you're reading it. So we're going to think about, again, which factors impact development of the artificial retina. And I'm going to read a little bit of text. And again, thanks for letting me know that you didn't have access to the text. When I sent that to the chat, I only sent to the hosts and moderators who already had the link. So thanks somebody for noting that you didn't get them. So I changed to everyone, and everyone should have all the links now to the handouts. All right, so we're going to do something called text coding. And text coding is where you provide your students with a specific code, something to look for or think about as they're reading. So we're going to, again, as we have already, I'll model this for you so you see how it works. And this particular text, we found these codes work well. It's history, and we're going to use an H or a red highlighter. We don't care how you do it, but you just need to mark a section of text or code it to say it's aligned with this code. So H is going to be history or red. C is going to be current, or I think that's purplish anyway. And F is going to be future, which is green. So what I'm going to do is read the first couple of paragraphs of this article and give you my thinking about why I've coded the text the way that I have on the screen. So the US Food and Drug Administration granted market approval to an artificial retina technology today, the first bionic eye to be approved for patients in the United States. So, I mean, it's saying that that happened today. So that sentence, again, Lori said it's actually almost exactly 10 years ago. But if you look at the date it was, put out, this is a press release saying that it just happened. So in terms of when this article was written, that is current. That's something that's happening right now. Yes, Thomas, good point. So today is an important word in this particular code because it's letting us know this is something that's happening right now. Excellent point. Okay, so the second sentence says the prosthetic technology was developed in part with support from the National Science Foundation. So in this particular sentence, verb tense is going to be, well, Thomas, you were still right. Verb tense is going to be important here, was developed. In many cases, the verb tense is going to tell you a little bit about whether this is past, present, or future, right? So was developed, that means it was done in the past. So that's going to be aligned with history. Okay, the next paragraph, the Argus 2 is manufactured by, it's saying it is manufactured by them currently. So I'm going to mark that as current, and will be distributed by Second Sight Medical Products of Sylmar, California. So will be distributed. So they haven't started distributing yet when this was written. So that is future. So I'm coding that as future. And again, it's in green because I'm saying it will be distributed by. That hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen in the future. Okay, then we move on to the next phrase, which is part of the team of scientists and engineers from the university, federal and private sectors, who spent nearly 2 decades developing the system with public and private investment. So it's saying in this particular clause, this team spent 2 decades developing the system. So that's already happened. And it's telling you how long it took. So yes, Jesse, very good point. Verb tenses are going to play a really important role in these particular codes. Now, how do you have students code? We really don't care. Some people use highlighters or sticky notes, or they have the student just write in pencil, a little letter on a piece of text. There's a lot of ways you could do it online. If your students are accessing text online, there's even more ways to do it. But we'll talk about the importance of this in a minute. But it's just a way to have students stop and think as they read. So I'm going to share another paragraph, and Lori read part of this with you. And what I want you to do is in the chat, I want you to put a word or a phrase that you think makes this aligned with a specific code. So I'll give you an example. Seeing my grandmother go blind motivated. Okay, that's something that happened in the past. So that's history. So I'd say seeing my grandmother go blind motivated me. And I would say equals H or something like that. So what I want you to do is look for a couple of words or phrases in this text that you think would make it align with one of these codes. Put the word or phrase in the chat box along with the equal sign and then what code you need to put the word or the letter, I don't care, in the chat to let me know how you're aligning these codes with your way of thinking as you read the paragraph. So I'll give you a minute to read the paragraph. And as you do that, look for words or phrases that you think are aligned with these codes and just type them in the chat box along with the code. It was history. Good, Thomas. Yep.
You may even see more than one code in one sentence.
It happens for sure. Good point, Corey. Foreseeable future. Yep. That's good, James. Thank you. Says the technology current. Absolutely. He's saying it right now. Develop the Argus. Yep. Current. And that's, I could see, and that's the point. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But yes, I would say so too. It was, has allowed history. Absolutely, Carol. Good. And so you get the concept of this. It was interdisciplinary history. Absolutely, it was. So a lot of different groups worked on it. Good. So what I want to make sure you understand what we would do next if we were in a group in person is actually I would have had you code that on your own. And then we would have talked about whether you agreed with this code or not. So we'd actually have to go back and reread the text. It was future, absolutely, Jacinta. So we would have you code it independently and then go back and talk about your codes and see if you had differences. And you probably would have some differences, and that's okay. In some cases, it's a little ambiguous, but you kind of want that. Now, if you're first teaching this to students, you want them to be clear cut. But as they learn this concept, you really kind of want the codes to be ambiguous because you want that conversation to ensue. Well, I see it this way. Well, I see it this way. And then have people defend why they put that code there. That actually is a good way to trick students into rereading text because we all know in many cases, students struggle to read the text the first time. If you can find tricks like this to have them go back and reread with a partner and validate their codes, it leads to really in-depth comprehension. The reason why this strategy works is that some students are what we call word callers. They will read an entire piece of text and they don't have any problem with decoding. And I know some students do have problems with decoding, but some don't have problems with decoding, but they have something called comprehension aphasia. So they actually read through a text, but they don't comprehend what they read because they're either spending so much of their mental energy actually decoding the text, or they haven't developed a pathway to hang that knowledge on. They don't have any background knowledge to connect it to. So in some cases, one of those two things are happening. So if you have them stop, and Lori's already told you, and you mentioned this up front, if you stop and reread and have to annotate in some way the text, it really aids comprehension. So for those students who suffer from comprehension, they can decode, but they suffer from comprehension issues. This task of rereading, reading, then thinking about something else and annotating the text, and then rereading it with a partner and checking their codes is a great way to help build comprehension. And I've said this before, I've said it many times, in terms of actual comprehension strategies, every comprehension strategy I've ever seen, and I've been doing this for a long time, it's either rereading, talking about what you've read, or writing about what you've read, or a combination of those three things. And that's really the only comprehension strategies I'm aware of. It's some combination of one or more of those things. So that's how text coding works. You have to think about codes and create them on your own as you're reading your text. There are what we call shallow codes that can be used with any text, like put a question mark if you're not sure of something, put an exclamation point if you're excited about something, put an equal sign if you agree with something. So there's different shallow codes you can use, but these type of deep codes that are actually connected with the text are very beneficial for many students.
Okay, so the next component, I want to take a moment and just remind you where we started and kind of where we are at this point. So we started with just an initial question that related to, what do you think would happen if there was some device that gave sight to the blind? And you addressed that question. Then we moved on to just some writing that was predictive. And we talked about that, and you jotted down some notes, or you would have jotted down some notes. And then we moved to some direct vocabulary instruction that addressed words that were directly from that text. And then we moved on to that text coding piece that Kevin just shared with you. So we've already done quite a lot with this particular text. We've looked at vocabulary, we've had opportunity to read it and code it, we've talked about it, we've done all those things that Kevin mentioned as being helpful to aid comprehension. And now we're going to move back to that writing piece, and we're going to write in response to what we read. And so that first writing piece is one where we were predictive. And so now you'll notice the phrase right before the question associated with this writing opportunity is according to the text. So we didn't have that initially because you hadn't read the text yet. So you just made some predictions. And so now we have read the text, we've coded it, and those codes help you think about what you've read. They also provided you with some insight into the structure of the text. The text is organized in such a way it gives you the history of the development of the device. It talks about where they are presently with it and where they hope to go with it in the future. So it gives you some things to kind of help you as you think about that organization and how everything fits together. Now we're moving back in this writing piece to think about those factors that impacted the development of the artificial retina. We predicted some of those, and so we may confirm some of our predictions, and I think that you probably would if you had the opportunity to read this entire article. In fact, I know you would. And then you'd have an opportunity to see maybe there were some things that you didn't think about that are mentioned in this article. And so you'd have an opportunity for your students to go back to the text, to think about it. And I want to emphasize here, this is not a memory test. And I used to think when I took assessments in school that, when it came to questions about the text, that I was cheating if I went back to the text. That's not cheating. That's really being very wise. And so in this particular opportunity, we want to make sure students understand you can go back and review the text. In fact, we want you to do that. That again, this opportunity provides you with the chance to revisit the text yet again for a different purpose. And we want to encourage that. So encouraging your students, go back to that text again, think about those factors, look for those factors that impacted the development of this particular device. And so in doing that, again, you can direct them to create a list, to write a short paragraph, in whatever form you'd like for them to record their writing, you can do that. But the whole idea is to drive them back to the text again, and then also have them have that opportunity to confirm any predictions and to write about text, in this case, to enhance their own comprehension, while they may not know that's what they're doing. And so here's the research behind this. We know that in grades 2 to 12, as they write about material they've read, and we know, just anecdotally for students beyond grade 12, that writing about text enhances our comprehension. You and I, as good readers, we do that. We annotate, we take notes. We know that writing in response to that reading is really important for us to do in order to enhance our comprehension. It's really useful, especially for our students who might be weaker readers or writing in particular. Didn't matter what kind of text we were talking about, expository, narrative, whatever. If they had a chance to write in response to that text, it enhanced the comprehension. So now we're going to move on to another strategy. Again, we're using multiple strategies during the course of engaging in one particular text, and this is a note-taking strategy. So here we've talked about those factors that might influence or might impact the development of the artificial retina. where here we have identified 4 of those. There's biology, technology, funding, and regulations. And we know there is ample information in this particular text that students can draw from in order to take notes from the text. And so we've delineated those categories for our students to provide them with some scaffolding. So they don't just go in and just take notes, or you don't, on the other hand, take the notes for them. And I know as a teacher, that was something I was inclined to do if I knew my students were not comprehending a text, or I anticipated they would struggle with it, then I would read it and I'd take the notes for them and they basically copied them. That's not helpful. And so in this manner, we're providing enough support where students can go back to the text yet again, and then take notes that pertain to those particular categories. And so you see where we've provided a couple of notes. You see the paragraph they come from. Your students don't have to write entire sentences. They can write phrases if you're okay with that, and just record the paragraph where they're from. And that way they can go back to the text and they know where that came from to prompt their own memories. And so you see there's a couple of notes there from the second paragraph of this particular text. It talks about the FDA granting market approval. And so that certainly relates to regulations. And then the next note has to do with technology. In part was developed with support from the National Science Foundation. Although technology is mentioned there, that's not the emphasis of this particular note. The emphasis is the funding. Now, could you say that this is related to technology? You certainly could. It's written right there. So sometimes what we do is like a check and a check plus, or a check and a check minus. So you might check funding, as that is then really the emphasis of this particular note. And you might put a check minus under technology, because it's the technology that's being developed with this money. And so that certainly is related as well. And so then you would ask your students then to go back to the text again, and then provide them with a graphic organizer like this. It certainly doesn't have to be this one in particular. They can do this just on a piece of notebook paper, where they just, create those columns, and you give them the headings, and they can go back to the text and record their notes on their own notebook paper in that way. And so you'd ask them to develop several notes that are related to each one of those categories. And they can do this on their own. They can do this with a partner. This is not just busy work, or this is not just work we're going to set aside. This actually is building to an extended discussion of text. And so these notes are going to be important to them as they move forward. So this is something that they're actually going to use in a task that's going to come up here in just a little bit. So I would like to then share with you the research base for this. We know that reading achievement is increased if students are allowed to categorize ideas, thoughts, concepts, using graphic organizers in particular. And that's because that's the way our brain works. We connect things to stuff we already know. And so if we can provide our students with a means to organize their thoughts and ideas, and to connect them to ideas and thoughts that they already have in their head, then that's very helpful. And I know that you may use graphic organizers in your classrooms. Can you share, what kinds of graphic organizers you use? Do you use different forms for taking notes? Is that something you do? I'll just give you a minute, just a brief description. I know it might be hard to describe that in the chat, but if you can just put in a phrase or a sentence that might share if there are specific graphic organizers you use, or where you find them, that might be helpful as a resource to others as well. So we'll let you put that in the chat real quickly. A bubble map? Okay, I like that. Yes. Finding the main idea, box at the top of the page, and then smaller ones coming off for supporting details. I love it. You're doing a great job of describing these.
They are.
So
Somebody
you
T-charts
go ahead.
early on too. Yeah, somebody mentioned T-charts.
T-charts. Yeah. So you get the idea. So you use some of these resources. So that's great. So we'll go on where our time is getting short. We want to make sure that we cover the rest of what we want to share with you, but you get the idea. So you do use some of those things. They are indeed research-based and very helpful.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lori, and definitely outlining circle maps, order of events, thinking maps. We have several really good ones mentioned. Thanks so much. So what we're going to do now, and I know you probably haven't had a chance to read the whole article by now, but you've learned a little bit more about it. So now that we'll pretend that you read the whole article, as Lori mentioned, the 4 categories we came up with were biology, technology, funding, and regulation. So going back to that first example we did in the chat where you thought about which factors you thought would be most important for developing this artificial retina, you came up with 3 of 4 that were actually in the article. So biology was mentioned, technology was mentioned, and funding was mentioned, and several of them were mentioned several times. Regulation's the only one that really didn't come up in our prediction, but showed up in the text itself. So what I want you to do now, and I know you probably haven't read the whole text yet, but just based on what you have learned about the text and your own thoughts, going back to your prediction if you want to, which of those 4 do you think has had the most significant impact on the development of the artificial retina? So pick one of those 4, and I'd have you do this in a small group if we were together, but which of those 4 do you think, after learning a little bit more about the development of the artificial retina, which of those 4 do you think has had the most significant impact on developing this? Good. Thanks, Christine. She's given her response. Good. Thomas is chiming in. Thank you. Good. And those are your 4 choices: biology, technology, funding, and regulations. Just those 4. Anyone else have a thought? Which of those 4 do you think might be most critical to developing this? Good. Yeah, we have a couple more people chiming in. Thank you. Good. So 3 of the 4 have been voted on so far. Excellent. Good. I see heavy leaning in one area. Good. And somebody's giving their second. Good. So lots of responses. So what I would do if I were actually hosting this class and we were in a room together, I would take note of how you are voting, and I would actually set you up in groups with the one that you voted most heavily in. I'd make you come to consensus. Then I'd set up groups, and you would actually have a debate over which of these you felt were the most, and you would have to actually look for more notes. So once you determined which one you feel as consensus is most important, I would make you go and find every note in the article to align with that, and then you have a debate among each other. And as a teacher, I would really appreciate this. And what we've seen students get so excited and motivated for this debate because they really want to defend their response, and they do this as a team. So yeah, I think almost everyone had been voted on. There's probably more for technology, then it looks like funding, then regulations, and biology only had 1. So that would be interesting to have a debate as well. So after the debate, I would re-vote and see if anyone's opinion had changed based on the debate topic that had been shared. And that's a really powerful strategy because students are comprehending because they're having a debate over it. So that's again a really helpful strategy to use. If you can get your students here, they clearly have understood the whole article. But the key is we've done so many things with this article that they have to remember and comprehend some just because they've been engaged with it so frequently. So we know there's research here too. If we allow our students to have these kind of discussions where they agree, disagree, and justify, it really helps you as a teacher too. Did my student understand this? You'll clearly know if they understood it just by hearing their debate. And there's dramatic improvement in reading when we can get our students to engage in lively and meaningful conversations around text. The critical part of this is coming up with those categories that lend themselves to this debate, which as a teacher you can do, but you really have to think and plan for it. Okay, so with this, I'm going to turn over to Lori, who's going to talk about our last strategy for today.
Okay, so one of the last things that we do in this sequence, and just as an aside, we know that you may not have the time to go through this entire sequence very often with your students, but there are certainly elements that you could pull out and use more frequently. And then those areas where students really struggle, or you have a concept that you really want your students to comprehend well, perhaps that could be the text that you select to use this whole sequence with. So we move on to question generation, and question generation just provides students with the chance to generate their own questions based on true wonderings, not necessarily to formulate test questions with multiple choice answers, but to think about what they really wonder about after all the work that they've done with this particular article. And you see a couple of questions that we came up with here and the categories they relate to. Uh, the questions that students may have may not relate to any of those categories, and that's fine. One of the questions that I had recently, we shared this lesson not too long ago, and we noticed the fact that this article was from a press release from 10 years ago, almost exactly. And so I looked up, I wondered what had happened since then. And we found actually that this technology has been built upon, and now they're to the point where they're growing proteins in the International Space Station for implantation on retinas to address the problem that this device was designed to address 10 years ago. So that was really interesting because that was my wondering, well, what's happened since this press release was released this 10 years ago? So that was a question I had. So we know that, again, that question generation can be very powerful. It's on the back of that same handout that you had to take your notes. You don't have to use that particularly, but you can if you'd like to. And then there is a strong research base related to question generation. And so we see that, and I always highlight that last sentence in bold. Question generation is an extremely potent technique showing larger effects than other comprehension strategy instruction techniques. And we don't often let our students have that opportunity to engage in writing or voicing questions of their own. So the last thing that we do then with students is then provide that chance for them to create a final written response. And you see the prompt according to the text and further discussion, in your opinion, which factor has had the most significant impact on the development of the artificial retina? So they would finish up with that writing opportunity. Okay. So hopefully our goal has been met. Thank you for participating so fully. And we've met our objectives as well. And we just thank you for engaging with us this afternoon. There's our references, questions. You can certainly enter them in the Q&A and we'll get back to you. And our email addresses are there as well. Please feel free to reach out anytime that we could provide support or help. We're glad to.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lori. So we do want you to give IPDAY your feedback. So while you're completing the poll, which IPDAY's just opened up, thanks so much, IPDAY. There's just 6 quick questions. And while you're completing that poll, I'd like to invite you to IPDAY's next webinar on February 21st, titled Leveraging the Power in the Hands of Our Students, Approaches, Activities, and Resources to Effectively Utilize Mobile Technology. We hope that you can tune in next week. Lori and I have really enjoyed facilitating this session. We've enjoyed the interaction as well. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we appreciate you and all that you do for your students every day. Again, I'll put our email addresses in the chat as well. Feel free to reach out anytime. We're always glad to hear from folks. So feel free to reach out if we can help you. We're glad to do so. But again, the both of us can't thank you enough for all that you do. Good. Thank you all, and we appreciate you. And James, I'm sure IPDAY will get back to you on your question.